Okay, I'll try to share my presentation and we can start, I guess. Just a second. How do I make it full screen if it's covered? Okay, so do you hear me well and do you see the screen? Yep.
Yes.
Say something. Okay, perfect. So we can start. My name is Yegor Grinik. I'm a biologist from Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group. Together with me today here is my colleague Petro Testov, who will jump in the Q&A session. Before jumping straight to the topic of biodiversity in the rare, we would like to share a bit about who we are as an organization. So basically, we are a Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group, or UNCG. We are a non-profit which was legally established in 2018 based on an informal group which was established 4 years before that. Our main goal is biodiversity conservation, and in order to facilitate biodiversity conservation in Ukraine, we gathered quite a huge team of more than 50 experts, scientists, and activists from all over Ukraine who sometimes work as staff members or who contribute on a case-by-case basis. We try to cover different fields which are related to nature conservation. First of all, we are quite active in the legislative field. We are actively opposing new legislation which is harmful or potentially harmful for biodiversity, and we also are quite active in promoting pro-biodiversity legislation, which I will cover briefly a bit later. We are also quite active in identification of different violations related to biodiversity. For example, we monitor illegal logging, we monitor illegal plowing, we monitor illegal mining, and cases like that. We are also trying to be quite active in the establishment of new protected areas. In the past years, most of the majority of protected areas in Ukraine were established with involvement of people who are related to Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group. We're also quite actively participating in the environmental impact assessment. We are monitoring projects which undergo environmental impact assessment, and we try to oppose the projects which are potentially negative for biodiversity. We also do quite a lot in the field of biodiversity monitoring. We try to promote scientific studies related to biodiversity. We try to collect the available data regarding biodiversity. In particular, we are quite active in the field of GBIF and different other things. And starting from February 2022, there is a new field of work which we try to be active in. It is the support to protected areas which were affected by the Russian invasion. Okay, now jumping actually to the topic itself. Why we're speaking about the biodiversity in the rare. By biodiversity in the rare, we mean biodiversity which is not on the front line, which is located far away from where the fighting takes place. Frontline biodiversity is something which is actually in the agenda. I mean, I guess most of people present here, they know about the Kakhovka Reservoir, they know about damaged protected areas, damaged forests, massive wildfires which are happening on the front line, and this is a huge tragedy and a huge negative impact on biodiversity. But to be honest, full-scale Russian invasion, it impacts not only frontline biodiversity, it impacts biodiversity far away from the front line. This happens through different indirect and sometimes quite complicated mechanisms, mostly related to financial problems which were caused by the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine, but not only. And therefore, we are we believe that this is also something which needs to be highlighted. This is something which needs to be kept in mind. First of all, because it's quite hard to impact what happens with the biodiversity on the front line, but it's much easier for us as civil society organizations to impact the processes which are related to biodiversity in the rear of Ukraine, in the territories which are controlled by Ukrainian government. And the second important point is that now everybody speaks about Ukraine's green recovery. Everybody agrees that Ukraine's recovery must be green, but at the same time, we believe that the biodiversity aspect is sometimes missing in these conversations, and we also believe that for Ukraine's recovery to be truly green, it needs to be biodiversity friendly. That's why we actually developed a publication which is available on our website in both English and Ukrainian, and we'll now try to briefly go through the most prominent points from the publication. But we encourage you to actually read the whole text. Okay, so we tried to divide all the impacts related to biodiversity into different spheres, and let's start with the forest. Of course, before the full-scale Russian invasion, there were different problems related to conservation of forest biodiversity in Ukraine. Most of the problems were related to unsustainable logging and to illegal logging. I divide these two terms because in a lot of cases logging can be legal but catastrophic for biodiversity, and illegal logging, well, it's not always a problem for biodiversity, but often it is. Starting from the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, the forest biodiversity is under the risks. First of all, because of the financial problems, which Ukraine as a state experiences in related to the full-scale Russian invasion. During the last 1.5 or even more years, calls for more logging to support the Ukrainian economy. They are becoming more and more loud and on very different levels, starting from the top authorities and ending up with some local communities. For example, on the screenshot, there is a Minister of the Environment of Ukraine together with the head of the state forest, then heads of the State Forest Agency of Ukraine, and they both officially communicated about the need to renew old growth forest and to increase the amounts of logging. Of course, these are not only the talks. There were some specific steps which were taken in order to facilitate the increase of logging. First of all, early in March 2022, a law was passed which actually cancelled silent season. Silent season was a ban on logging in different biodiversity valuable forests in Ukraine. In particular, it was related to protected areas. So starting from the full-scale Russian invasion, this silent season, this prohibition for logging was cancelled. There were numerous other legal initiatives which were successful and which removed the different environmental restrictions or limitations or conditions for logging. For example, biological studies which were mandatory for forest management planning, they were also cancelled. In general, it all goes in line with the communication of the Ukrainian top authorities. For example, in 2022, there was a Ukraine's recovery conference, high-level conference, which took place in Switzerland, in Lugano, and renewal of old forests was one of the projects which was presented by the Ukrainian government, together with multiple other projects, for example, construction of new forest roads. At the same time, we still experience a huge problem, which is a lack of environmental control. The main governmental body in charge of environmental control, including the control in the forest, is the State Environmental Inspection. Starting from February 2022, it's literally paralyzed. There are no inspections in place now because of the significant legal limitations, but also because of the position of different authorities. So the question of and the problem of illegal logging, also harmful for biodiversity, is much more significant. There were also multiple other attempts to simplify the legislation in order to increase the amounts of logging. For example, there was an attempt to completely change the legal rules for logging in order to remove most of the environmental restrictions. Because of the quite successful work of different NGOs, these attempts were not successful, but there are new attempts which are ongoing now, and we are not sure that they will not be successful. Apart from legal changes, there were also a lot of management changes since February 2022. The most important of them is that most of the forests in Ukraine are state-owned, and before 2022, they were managed by different state forest enterprises. Now, most of the state forest enterprises were merged into a single state company, which is called Forests of Ukraine. And there is clear communication from the management of the company for the need to increase the amounts of logging, need to renew old growth forests, need to build much more new forest roads, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, we don't see any clear communication on biodiversity protection and so on and so forth. And this goes in line with the activities which are actually conducted by the new state company. For example, during the last 9 months, the new state company Forest of Ukraine, they approved only 700 hectares of forest to become protected areas, which is extremely low and much lower than we observed in the previous years. So what we see now is that the new state forest company is actually has a clear anti-protected area position, and it was all about unsustainable logging. But there is also a case and issue of illegal logging. Illegal logging was always a problem for Ukraine, especially illegal logging with documents. Unfortunately, as you can understand, without proper environmental control and without any legal changes, the situation did not change for better. Illegal logging is still a major issue in Ukraine, and in general, there is a high risk that the wood or wood products which are imported by the European Union, and this happens now, European Union is the biggest importer of wood from Ukraine, there is a huge risk that these products are illegal. Another significant problem for Ukraine was always deforestation. Deforestation is mostly related to unaccounted forests. According to some studies and to some estimations, there are more than 500,000 hectares of forests which are not considered forest in the documents. Mostly they are naturally afforested agricultural lands. Unfortunately, they are often a subject of conversion into agricultural lands or for lands devoted to some construction or whatsoever. And during the last 1.5 years, we observed numerous attempts to simplify the legislation to convert unaccounted and also other forests into lands for example, communication facilities. And unfortunately, a lot of these legal attempts were successful.
Hello.
And the legislation was simplified. There are also significant risks for unaccounted forests from new recovery infrastructure projects. There are a lot of talks in Ukraine now about new construction or new development, and of course there are no safeguards in relation to unaccounted and other forests. There were also some minor positive changes. For example, the government adopted a law 5650, which makes it possible to protect unaccounted forests, to provide them with official status of the forest. But unfortunately, this process is voluntary, it's not mandatory. So most of the landowners which possess unaccounted forests, they don't have any obligations to protect this forest. Another big group of nature ecosystems which worth mentioning are grasslands. As you all know, grasslands are ecosystems which were not trees but herbaceous species dominate. Unfortunately, during the last several centuries, most of Ukrainian grasslands, and we're speaking mainly about Ukrainian steppes or Ukrainian meadows, most of them were converted into agricultural lands. For example, what we have now is that in Ukraine, in Ukraine we have no more than 3% of the historical areas of steppes. But at the same time, these are very important nature ecosystems, very important in terms of climate change, very important as habitats of protected species. For example, more than half of the species from the red list of Ukraine, their habitat is steppe. At the same time, Ukraine was always perceived as agricultural country, and Ukraine is among top 3 countries with biggest share of agricultural lands. Around 60% of Ukrainian territory is plowed, and it's actually a cropland, and we observe some increase in these areas. The biggest problems before the full-scale Russian invasion was that most of Ukrainian grasslands were not accounted and therefore not protected. So legal or illegal plowing of grasslands, conversion of grasslands into agricultural lands was a major problem. Unfortunately, this situation got worse since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. As you all know, significant areas of Ukrainian agricultural lands are now occupied or are located on the front line or are mined and therefore not suitable for agricultural use. So there is a general governmental idea to compensate for the losses and to convert new grasslands into agricultural lands so that the economy has some sort of compensation for agricultural lands which cannot be used now. Such projects, for example, were also presented by the Ukrainian government in Switzerland in 2022. This led to numerous legal initiatives aimed at simplification of the use of the vacant lands. Vacant lands are basically lands which are not used for agriculture now, and most of these lands are either grasslands or unaccounted forests. Unfortunately, a lot of these legal initiatives were successful. It's not only related to agriculture. There are initiatives to simplify the use of vacant lands, for example, for construction. And the problem is also exacerbated by the fact that State Cadastre Service, which is the main governmental body in charge of the control, for example, for illegal plowing, it's also paralyzed in the same way as state environmental inspections. There are no inspections now, and therefore all the violations related to conversion of grasslands, they basically remain unchecked. And this is also a significant problem which was caused by the full-scale Russian invasion. Another important issue worth mentioning are the protected areas. They now cover, nationally designated protected areas. They cover now only 7% of Ukraine's territory. We can compare it, for example, to 15% which are indicated in Ukraine's strategic documents, or 30% which are mentioned, for example, in the EU biodiversity strategy. And the biggest problem is that in 2022, establishment of new protected areas, that was definitely not the governmental priority. In 2022, we observed that only 0.01 of Ukrainian's territory got protected status. This is an extremely small number. Another problems are related to the protected areas, already existing protected areas. Unfortunately, as a consequence of full-scale Russian invasion, already existing national parks or nature reserves, they experience significant financial problems, which were of course present before the full-scale invasion, but now they got worse. And they also experience human resources problems because of the immigration or conscription of different people who were active in these protected areas. And what is also important is that any protected areas are a vital safeguard for truly green recovery. And this is something also to be considered in future if we aim at the recovery to be truly green. What's also interesting? Let's talk a bit about the environmental civic movement, because basically NGOs were the main drivers of all biodiversity positive changes in Ukraine in the recent years. And unfortunately, environmental civic movement in Ukraine was also negatively affected by the full-scale Russian invasion. Obvious negative factors are immigration and military service, which is relevant for different activists and from all over Ukraine. But there are also other problems. Starting from the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, the government closed or limited access to many documents and resources which were previously public. For example, the forest maps are now completely closed, which makes it impossible to use any documents related to logging or forest management. Land cadastre is also completely closed for public access, which means that it's quite hard or even impossible to identify illegal plowing, illegal conversion of grasslands into some other lands, and so on and so forth. Entrance to the forests is also prohibited in many regions of Ukraine, including the ones which are located far away from the front line. Most of these limitations have no reasoning in terms of national security, but they are still in place, and unfortunately we don't see any changes here. There is also a significant problem of the general decrease of public attention to biodiversity. Of course, everyone in Ukraine is now focused on what happens on the front line. This is quite obvious. You can expect that, but of course, it makes quite hard for the environmental civic movement to raise problems and to ask for solutions. Another significant problem is business deregulation, which is an idea which is promoted by the government in the recent years, also starting from the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. For example, in 2022, the government produced a draft law 8058. If it was successful, it would make it possible for the government to change any legislation related to the use of natural resources without any public notice, without any public participation, and so on and so forth. Luckily, because of the opposition from the NGOs, this draft law was postponed, but there are numerous other initiatives which are being developed by the government. Another important aspect is the environmental impact assessment procedure. It was introduced in Ukraine in 2017. It was quite successful before the full-scale Russian invasion, but since the invasion began, the situation got worse. First of all, the scope of the environmental impact assessment was limited in March 2022. Now it's not related to all recovery projects, and at the same time, there is no definition of what a recovery project is. So there could be significant problems in projects which do not undergo environmental impact assessment, and there is no clear reasoning for that. Another significant problem is that we had a governmental register, online register of all projects undergoing environmental impact assessment. It was online and it was public and the access was free, but now it's closed. You can get the documents only after freedom of information requests, and in a lot of cases you end up with having nothing. And this is a significant problem because it significantly limits public participation in the environmental impact assessment. Another problem is the decision making by the authorities, the national authorities and the regional authorities. Since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, it's quite poor. It was also not really good before the full-scale Russian invasion, but in a lot of cases, especially on the regional level, it became only worse. And at the same time, as for protected areas, high-quality environmental impact assessment is something which is vital for truly green recovery, because the projects need to undergo it and the decision-making must be high quality. So this is another problem and another consequence of the full-scale Russian invasion. Of course, we don't aim to cover all the problems here in the presentation. We once again encourage you to read the complete publication, which is available on UNCG website. But we also wanted to speak a few minutes about the solutions for truly green recovery, because as we said, we believe that recovery can be truly green only if it's biodiversity friendly. We believe that now Ukrainian legislation and practices lacks biodiversity safeguards. Mainly, we really lack new protected areas in Ukraine. We also lack legal protection for old growth forests and also for other forests which are critical for biodiversity protection. We also definitely lack the inventory of grasslands, and we lack legal protection for both grasslands and wetlands. We definitely lack proper environmental control, and for example, there is a draft law 3091, which was passed in the first reading in 2021, but now it's also on pause. We definitely lack transparency, because this is something which enables civil society to monitor what's going on with biodiversity and to impact the processes. And the last but not least, we definitely lack properly functioning environmental impact assessment procedure. So this is what we, in a nutshell, what we believe to be solutions for truly green recovery related to biodiversity. But the main solution, of course, is military and economic support for Ukraine, because as we said before, most of these problems, they were caused by the full-scale Russian invasion. As soon as the war is over, as soon as there is no potential for new aggression from Russian Federation, only under that conditions we can completely focus on biodiversity conservation, and these processes can be truly effective. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, we will be happy to answer them. Just a second. I'm here together with my colleague Petro Testov. Petro understands English but doesn't speak English, so I will serve as a translator for him. Roman, yes, please.
Yes. Hello. Thanks for the great presentation. Um, I'm a farmer since 2008, starting with the South Kherson region, and I ended up in occupation in 2022 in Chernihiv region with much smaller operation right on the border with Belarus and Russia. In Horodnya region, in district. In Horodnya district had about 4,000 hectares of what you include in this 500,000 unregistered forests, young forests. I have to admit, all of them have been cut, and by now, yeah. During the occupation, there was a bit of moratorium, but as soon as the occupation was over, all of those young forests were cut completely because there was, as you correctly mentioned, there were no inspections whatsoever in place, and the trees were much, much bigger than normally would be allowed for the recultivation of or reclaiming of agricultural land. So that is probably not an option anymore. And I would only suggest now, it's not a question, but a general suggestion to focus on the legislation in place and try to protect the land that is available, that is reachable, that is buy in order to protect, or lease long-term in order to protect. That's the only way out. For example, my family has 3 hectares, my father has 3 hectares of agricultural land that I'm willing to dedicate to such a project of land conservation. My big idea that I shared with some colleagues that I believe also on this group now is to have 10 million hectares of the agricultural lands that Ukraine currently has as registered agricultural lands to be dedicated to this private or international international public foundation of conservation, with a focus, of course, on the affected by the war territories. This could as well be a peacemaking effort, because if we are to talk about any peacemaking in the coming years, that would be the effort that can be taken on by the crowns, by the British crown, by the Norwegian crown, by the Danish, Dutch, Japanese, wherever else, because Putin does not want to stop the war. Yeah, and whoever he is working with, and you've seen now the COP28 is not making much progress on the limitation of the fossil fuels. So the only way is to work with the interested crowns that could be interested in the decarbonization through this type of international foundation that would make natural conservation of the Ukrainian lands possible. So basically, we could talk about the demilitarization zone of what is now the front line, and further on what's occupied by Russia, and dedicate that to a natural conservation fund. That's just a quick idea. It's a crazy idea, I know. It's a radical idea, but that's something that could be thought and talked about. But in general, just to once again stress out that only the land, and we have private, state, and communal land currently by the law. So only that type of land should be discussed as possible to acquire and to be used for natural conservation effort in Ukraine in general. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. Basically, yes, you're not the first to raise the idea of the protection of the lands which were on the front line or which were occupied. No, unfortunately, well, it's rather an idea now than something realistic, but we hope that maybe these talks will be much more active in the coming years. And also what you said about legal protection of unaccounted forests. Yes, this was also an idea which we promoted when advocating for the law 5650. Unfortunately, it was not successful by now, but we're still seeking for some kind of solutions for legal requirements for protection of old growth forest. Maybe Petro wants to add something. No, Petro doesn't. Maybe any other questions? Yeah. Oli, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Olli Turunen. I'm from Finland, from Helsinki, from Finnish Association for Nature Conservation. We are the biggest environmental NGO in Finland and almost 100 years old organization. And I'm the coordinator of neighborhood country cooperation and development cooperation. I have done 20 years cooperation with Russian NGOs to protect old growth forest in Russia, and they are still my partners, and definitely for Ukraine. And we had already before the war actually application to our fund project with Ukrainian NGOs to study old growth forest and illegal loggings. But that time our government commented that their priority is Africa because more poorer country. But now the idea has of course changed, and even we have this white right party, True Finns, in our government. They support to increase different kind of development and capacity building in Ukraine. So I'm really interested in making projects with you, and I think our government like to also gives the support for this cooperation. But just a comment, this presentation of yours was really interesting, quite much I already expected, which will happen, similar things happens quite often in Russia. And I don't know if you are aware, but there are really interesting studies made by Russian NGOs, and they have been in danger because of their government about the areas in Crimea. And these areas which were earlier, when it belonged to, it was part of the Ukraine practically, there were nature protection areas and bird reserves. And Russian NGOs made studies how these areas were completely cancelled and built, and they had some problems with police of this because of this. I mean, NGO people had problems. So I don't know if you have contact with these Russian NGO people. They are really heavily criticizing the Russian government already during that time, but now they are mainly abroad. And there are also, I think, some Russian colleagues who like to continue cooperation, and they are especially good in remote sensing and using high-resolution satellite image data to observe different kind of effects. So just inform that that's my background, and I definitely like to follow this Ukrainian, not only war, but this environmental cases like I did before the war even. And as I commented, I hope that this session will be recorded as I see and shared. Then I can share it to Finnish people here. There are a lot of people who like to know more about these things, and especially our organization. So keep us informed, and thank you for this effort from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your interest. Of course, we're interested in collaboration with Finnish partners. That's definitely something I think we can stay in touch afterwards. And regarding what you said about Crimea, yeah, one of our colleagues, who is basically the head of our organization, participated in researches related to what happened with the protected areas in Crimea after Russia's occupation. Yes, and it was definitely a significant problem. And yes, the recording of this session will be distributed through the same channels where we announced the session itself. Any more questions? If no, we can, I think, we can end, I think. Okay, so if there are no questions, once again, thank you very much for participating in the session. We once again encourage you to study the publication itself and not only the presentation. They are available on our website, on the website of Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group. By the way, I think I need to share the links. Just a second. So here are the links. Yep. So now in the chat there is a link to English and Ukrainian versions of the publication. Okay, so once again, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and maybe we will meet on some further sessions. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye.